Yes, I know.
But I'm not going to the university.
Oh, okay, so they already have it.
I already have it. Just as you Great.
Yeah. 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 I just find that it's missing. And you like this much. For it to be like, okay, just take it somewhere different. Really? Have another one. Yeah, that's like. So pretty. I saw that on her blog. And my friend has that. Yeah.
All right, everybody.
Okay.
Ready to get going? Wednesday. Very good. Again. Being so well behaved when it comes to marks. It's awesome. I know it's frustrating. My lecture on Friday is 2 hours in one of these. Okay. So this morning we're still just a little bit behind, and just a heads up for the quiz, right? So the quiz is on fossil fuels, and we won't quite have gotten to the end of that, but that's okay because I expect you to have sat down and read through the chapter anyway. And certainly, take a look at coal and oil and natural gas. It's not the nitty-gritty details, but as you read through that chapter, you'll get a sense as to the major points which we will go over this morning. So the first 10, 15 minutes this morning, I just want to wrap up the material in the PowerPoint or the PDF that says energy context, and then we'll get to fossil fuel. So we ended here, I think, with this concept or this fact that about 1.5 billion people don't have access to electricity. And the challenge moving forward, right, is just like food, is if we've got 1.5 billion people that don't have access to electricity, and electricity is absolutely the foundation for economic development and prosperity. I think I made that point when I showed you that GDP and electricity consumption diagram, right? If you keep people literally in the dark, then they're completely hamstrung in terms of economic development and bringing people out of poverty and so on, right? So if we've got 1.5 billion people that don't have access to electricity, then what's the next 30 years going to look like? What are we going to do when those 2.5 billion people come along? So let me use this little diagram. I took this as inspiration from a TED talk online as just a very simple way of illustrating the challenge ahead, right? So what does this funky little diagram show here? So each one of these figures represents 1 billion people. So this is in 2010. And again, that 2010, remember 2011 was when we went through 7 billion people in terms of population. So back in 2010, right, this is what the world looked like, very generally speaking. And this is divided into 4 groups based on their income per day. In other words, on the left-hand side here are 2 billion people that are living on less than $2 a day, right? And each of these little squares here represents a unit of energy. So what this means is, instead of putting up the exact number of how many billion terawatt hours of energy was being used in 2010, we're just taking that and representing it by these units, by these square blocks, right? So in 2010, the world used 12 units of energy. I think that just keeps it really simple, right? So 2010, that 12 represents 12 blocks or 12 units of energy, right? And the 2 billion living on less than $2 a day, each used about half a unit of energy, about half of one of those blocks. And the reason is that they don't have access to electricity back in 2010. We just started with the slide saying 1.5 billion. Back in 2010, it was about 2 billion people, right? That don't have access to electricity, and they get their energy needs from the burning of biomass, burning of wood, the collection of fuel. Does that make sense, right? Then we have these 3 billion people that live in the zone where they're using or living on between $2 to $40 a day, somewhere what we would call the sort of lower to middle income groups. And they each consume a block of energy, and they have access to electricity, right? Basic electricity. And then we've got 1 billion people in the $40 to $80 per day, and they not only have access to electricity, they have things like washing machines, right? And then we've got 1 billion people on the right-hand side that are living on greater than $80 a day, and they not only have washing machines, but they take vacations and vehicles. They have vehicles and things like that. So the 1 billion in the 40 to 80 are consuming 2 units of energy, but the right-hand side here, the 1 billion in the 80 plus are consuming 6 units of energy. So you add up those blocks, right, and it adds up to 12 units of energy. Does that make sense to everybody? Just a graphical portrayal of the state in the world in 2010. So what do you think happens as we move forward then to 2050, right? Well, not everybody stays in those groups. You would assume that the 1 billion people who have washing machines are going to keep developing, and they're going to want to get wealthier. We know the world is getting healthier and wealthier. And so presumably that 1 billion people move into the $80 a day. And let's assume that they each now consume those 6 units of energy, right? Everybody starts shifting towards the right here. The 3 billion that have access to electricity that are using 1 block now have washing machines and are each using 2. And the 2 billion that are getting their energy needs from biomass, right, are probably going to move to the right. Oh, and by the way, we're going to add another 2 billion to that, more or less, right? So here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 billion people. And if they're each just moving along this transition into greater consumption of our electricity, the idea here is by 2050, we'll have increased electricity or energy consumption to 22 units, right? That's an enormous jump. Now, how likely is that to happen? Well, we can probably take 4 of those boxes off the table just by efficiency, right? Becoming more efficient, right? Electrifying the grid, okay? Perhaps using EV cars, right? Reducing our consumption of coal, or whatever the case may be. But I think the estimates are is that we can reduce our energy consumption by 4 boxes by efficiency, right? So we've gone from 12 units of energy in 2010 to 18 units of energy by 2050. I think that's a reasonable assumption, right? So we've increased our electricity or energy consumption here by at least 1/3, right? Just purely because of economic development. And I guess the key question here, as it relates to this class, is how many of those boxes can we turn green, right? Can 50% of our energy come from quote unquote green sources, right? Whether you may think that solar is green or EV vehicles or whatever the case may be. This energy transition that everybody is talking about, right? So do those 18 units become 9 units of fossil fuels and 9 units of green? Or where is that mix or that balance going to be, right? So that's the challenge. Again, I didn't want to tie specific numbers because they're gigantic numbers and they're, in many ways, they're just meaningless. But that's the challenge and the concept or the context of this. And so when we actually look at the projected increase in the demand for energy moving forward, so this goes back to 2010, and it's the projected increase in energy demand going through to 2035. So this comes from the British Petroleum projections. I always go to BP and Shell and ExxonMobil because they have 3 very large, very good energy futures groups that work with them, as you would imagine. The vertical axis here, incidentally, don't worry too much about this, but I'll mention what it is. MTOE is just a unit of energy. It's called million tons of oil equivalent, right? That's just how much energy would we consume if we're burning 1 million tons of oil. Okay, I know that probably means absolutely nothing to you, but that's just how the energy world works. But the point here is look at the colors and look at where the demand is coming from, right? So as we go from 2010 to 2020, and especially as we go out to 2035, look where that demand comes from. The green curve, that green section is the OECD. Remember the OECD from that diagram we showed a couple of weeks ago? That's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. That's us, right? That's the G8 or maybe the G20, right? So those are the economically developed countries. The rest of the world, Middle East, Russia, look at India and China, right? In terms of where the demand is coming from. We've got, you know, by 2035 to 2040, remember those 2 countries are going to be the most populous in the world. Okay, and not only are they going to be the most populous, they're going to continue to develop, maybe not as rapidly as they have, perhaps in the case of China in the last 20 years, but they are going to continue to ramp up their development. And that economic development has to be fueled by something, literally, right? It's got to be powered by energy, by electricity. So that's an extraordinary, I think, especially when you look at China, right? That's an extraordinary projection as to where the world is going by 2035 in terms of the demand for energy. Questions? Make sense? All good? Okay, so big challenges there ahead internationally. All right, so let's just talk about electricity here for a minute. I want to contextualize global electricity consumption and then just talk about the US for a bit, and then we'll jump straight into fossil fuels. So sometimes I do this, I shouldn't do it interchangeably, but I need to be more conscious about using the term energy and electricity, right? So energy is the total consumption of energy that includes transportation fuels. Electricity is specifically, obviously, exactly that, the generation of electrons. And so this is 2019. global electricity consumption by fuel type. In other words, where do we get our electricity from globally, right? So transportation fuels are off the table here. Don't worry about putting gas into your vehicle. That's not shown here. So what do you see? Natural gas is 29%, coal 22%, nuclear 18%, hydro. Wind, other includes things like burning biomass, right? And then solar. Anything surprise you there or not? Or is that pretty much what you would expect? So this is global electricity consumption. These percentages, folks, vary enormously depending on what country you're in, okay? And as you'll see in a minute, they vary depending on what state you're in. I think there's some quite interesting diagrams coming up, but that's the global picture, right? And so these are the ones that we're going to tackle. We're going to tackle coal and natural gas, and then we have to talk about oil, not as part of electricity, but obviously as part of global energy consumption, right? So yeah, question. Say that again.
Is hydro energy considered a green energy, or does it have a lot of questions?
Okay, so that's a great question. Is hydro considered green? Yes, it is. You know, it's kind of, you know, your definition of green will vary depending on someone else's, but it's considered renewable, right? It's a renewable resource. And so that's an interesting question, because we talk about fossil fuels, we talk about clean energy. Okay, so people in the natural gas industry would argue that natural gas is part of the clean energy transformation. And the environmentalists would say absolutely not, because it's a fossil fuel and you're burning stuff and you're contributing. But there are others that would say natural gas is twice as clean as coal. And that's a fact. It certainly is from an emissions perspective. Then there's the issue of what is renewable and what is sustainable. All right, we'll talk about that when we look at nuclear. Is nuclear renewable and or sustainable? But hydro is considered quote unquote clean, green energy, obviously, as is wind and solar, right? But you can see from an electricity perspective, if you just look at the fossils, so natural gas and coal, right? 51% of all of the world's electricity comes from natural gas and coal. Another one of those sort of pragmatic hard truths, right? There's no way in 5 years or 10 years we're going to take the right-hand half of that donut and just replace that donut with green, right? Or nuclear. Everything has these very, very complicated economic and environmental trade-offs, which we're going to look at, right? This is an interesting one for me. We're going to talk a little bit more about this morning, which is coal. It's always fascinating to me to look at the coal lobby here in the United States and how that plays out when it comes to the elections, right? I may have mentioned this before, but certainly the last 4, probably 5 election cycles, I remember specifically President Trump and President Biden, President Obama, President Bush, certainly President Clinton, all saying, you know, we need to keep coal as part of the, you know, coal has jobs. It's very hard to go into West Virginia or Kentucky on a political campaign and say we're going to shut down coal. But you'll see when we talk about coal, how that is a technology that is unequivocally on the way out. Okay, this whole notion, and I don't say this to be political, but this notion of making coal great again is just not going to happen. And that's being driven by the market, right? Not by the politics, as I hope to show you. So that's the global picture, right? I'm going to show you some. I didn't include these diagrams in the book because they came out after the publication, but I just thought I would show you a fun and interesting way to look at electricity in the United States by state. So there's a diagram in the book that shows this just slightly differently. It has 2004 to 2018, and it shows different lines, okay? So this is kind of a fun way to do it. So let me just explain what we're looking at here. So we've got 2001 to 2019, and it shows year by year the percentage of electricity generation by fuel source. So the dark one is coal, right? This purple is nuclear, natural gas is orange, hydroelectric is blue, then we've got wind in this other blue, yellow is solar, and this kind of reddish is other, including biomass, right? Now, don't panic too much when you see something like this, when you see this massive flip, right, where coal suddenly flips with natural gas. That's just the way it's plotting. All it says is that at that particular juncture, natural gas becomes more important, that percentages increase relative to coal, right? So look at 2001 here in the United States. In 2001, 51% of our electricity came from coal. Half of all of our electricity came from burning coal in 2001. 2019, that number over there is 23%. Flat. 23%, right? And I think the previous one, this pie chart, globally coal is 22. So the consumption of coal in the United States is right in line with what we're seeing globally, right? The use of coal has dropped from 50%, half of all of our electricity, to 23, right? That's extraordinary. And the projections are that that is just going to keep going down. Folks, it's a 19th century technology to boil a pot of water, right? Take this stuff out, you burn it, it produces lots of emissions and bad stuff, as we'll talk about, and that just to create steam. The coal is 23%. Natural gas has gone from 17% to 38%, right? That has been driven, as we'll talk about, by the shale boom, right? By fracking and what's happening right under our feet and in West Texas and other parts of the world. Look how stable nuclear has been, right, in the United States. Nuclear has gone from 21 to 19%. We've had a couple of power plants come offline, but nuclear has been very, very stable across the last 2 decades. And there's a reason for that. And we'll talk about that when we get to nuclear. Wind has gone from almost negligible to 7%. Solar is starting to increase. And hydroelectric has also been pretty stable from about 6 to 7%, right? So again, I don't know if anything strikes you as strange about that, but I'll email you the URL. This is a New York Times article, because what's really fun about this is you can put in your particular state and see where it's generated. So I'm just going to pull out a couple here. Sorry, these are static diagrams. So you'll have to look at your own state in your own time. Here's Pennsylvania, right? Look at Pennsylvania here, right? Coal was 57% in 2001. Now it's 17% in Pennsylvania, right? Again, there's no coming back from that, okay? Nuclear, 37%, 36%, very, very stable. Natural gas in Pennsylvania, the Marcellus Shale, the fracking technology has absolutely opened that up tremendously. So there's Pennsylvania. Here's Iowa. I don't know if any of you from Iowa, this is your state, right? Wind power has surged in Iowa. So in 2001, wind power accounted for about 2% of the electricity in Iowa. Now, 42%, right? That's extraordinary, I think. And so a lot of people that I talk to kind of are very, I don't know if they're anti-wind, but they're certainly skeptical. They're like, well, I don't think this technology works. And when the wind doesn't blow, the power isn't generated. And then you look at a state like Iowa, where 40% plus of the electricity comes from wind, right? So we're going to explore that in a bit more detail, not next week, probably the week after, when we start unpacking the renewables. So that's an interesting one with Iowa. Here's Nevada. Look at coal in Nevada, 52% to 7, right? It's done. Another 10 years, there won't be any coal-fired power plants in Nevada. Look at natural gas, 34 to 64. Solar has taken off in Nevada, as you would imagine, lots of sun, and we'll look at the solar resource a little later on, okay? I know some of you are probably from California. California is an interesting one. There's no coal, essentially. California is now done with coal. Natural gas has gone from 56, it's decreased, but it's still up there in the 40%. Look at solar in California, right? For obvious reasons. Again, there's a lot of solar resource down there in terms of kilowatt hour, okay? And hydroelectric is important. And of course, we have to end with the great state of Texas, right? So Texas, 51%, natural gas, 53%. Natural gas has been so consistent for 20 years because this is where the shale boom started. This is where we started fracking in the mid-1980s, right? So natural gas has been here for a while. Look at wind in Texas. 2001, wind was less than 0.5% in Texas. It's now, actually in 2020, it's now up to 18, almost 19% of our electricity comes from wind in Texas, right? So this is not some kind of odd eco hippie weird technology that we're trying to push on people. It's a fundamental part of the electricity grid. Yeah. 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 So I thought about doing that now, but I'll do it right at the end. I'll spend 10 more minutes talking about Snowden, and I'll show you how that all played out, exactly what happened with the generation, the demand, and what happened. So we heard that a lot, right? So you all remember that, February. We get this incredible freeze and the power grid collapses, right? Texas is, I could go on for hours on this, but I won't. So Texas is such a unique little independent country that we have our own electricity grid, right? I don't know if you know that, it's called ERCOT. So the rest of the United States is on the Pacific grid and the Atlantic grid, not Texas. We have our own, and 85% of all of our electricity is managed and stays within the state. There's a little bit out in east and a little bit west that crosses borders, but this little independent nation keeps it all here. So ERCOT manages that, right? And so what happens, we get this incredible cold spell, right? Just extraordinary, historically cold temperatures, and we lose electricity. And what do I see on a lot of the media outlets? That all the wind, it's all wind's fault, right? This whole Green New Deal, the wind turbines froze and they didn't work, okay? So that's true, but nothing worked, okay? Everything began to fail. Natural gas failed because the pipes froze, right? They couldn't get the electricity to heat the pipes. The wind turbines stopped because they're not winterized in Texas, okay? They kept going just perfectly fine in Iowa because they're winterized. Those gearboxes in the top of the wind turbines are heated. And so the wind turbine can operate in freezing conditions. They're not winterized here because that was, you know, a 100-year or a 200-year event, and it's very expensive to winterize them, okay? The coal began to fail, natural gas failed, nuclear went offline, everything failed. The entire system could not take that kind of coal and that kind of demand. So wind was part of it. So one technology that actually performed the best, surprisingly, even though it also lost generation capacity, was solar. Okay, because yeah, you cover solar panels with snow, that's problematic, but if you can clear them fast enough, solar kept going once they were able to clear them. So it's a good question, right? It's kind of, I don't know, I saw a lot of anti-wind and anti-solar sentiment there, and it was just not true. It was a big lie. Yes, wind went down. Everything went down. It was all to blame because of the lack of investment in winterizing the infrastructure in tech. It's going to be really interesting to see what comes of that, right? The commission that's going to look at that and how they're going to develop that. Anything else? Great question. Yeah. Any other comments before we go and talk specifically about the one I hate more than any other, and that's just my opinion. That kind of freeze? Yeah, so that's a, you know, we're going to look at that when we talk about climate, because there is this notion that as we begin to change climates, these extremes are going to ramp up, right? We're going to see more intense heat, we're going to see more intense cold and so on. I think that's likely. That was just a really extraordinary outburst of cold air. So it's certainly possible that it's going to happen. Well, it's possible. But in the short term, probably not probable. Of course, having said that, then they come again. Else on snowbird before we get going. Okay, cool. All right. How are we doing? 25 minutes. Pretty good. Let me talk about coal. Okay. So this is where I just have to say this is my opinion. I'm an anything but coal person. So as an environmental person, I work in the environmental department, run the Environmental Institute, all these things, and I talk a lot about energy. I think a lot of people expect me to be just anti-fossil fuel or anti-nuclear or anti-anything that isn't quote unquote green, right, or clean. But this is one that is, to me, the most problematic. One, it's a chronically outdated technology, and two, it's just dirt. I mean, it just simply is. But the question here is, can we realistically abandon coal? The answer to that is no, right? Not in the short term, and certainly not in overseas markets, where countries like China, right? Remember the China growth demand? Where countries like China are opening a coal-fired power plant about every 2 weeks. Okay? It is still one of, if not the cheapest way to generate electricity, right? Not from an environmental perspective, but just in terms of digging the stuff up, burning it, and generating heat to turn water into steam. Okay, so can we realistically abandon it? It's problematic. So coal, of course, drives the Industrial Revolution, right? So here we go back 1840, 1850, and we can see burning of wood is what we use, and then coal begins to take off in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, and that switch drives the Industrial Revolution, right? The internal combustion engine. It is, of course, just simply prehistoric vegetation. That's all coal is, right? Most of the, not most, a lot of the world's coal was formed during a period of about 350 million years ago called the Carboniferous, right? It was much warmer and we had lots of vegetation. That vegetation dies, it decomposes, and then it gets buried under sediments and it gets subjected to increasing pressure and heat. And as that happens, that vegetation changes over time, right? It changes from vegetation into peat and then into various grades of coal as that organic material is subjected to this pressure and the heat over time. So that's all coal is. It's just the transformation of prehistoric vegetation. Now, you may have heard this term, I don't know if you've heard the term clean coal, right? So that's something that we need to just think about. Is there cleaner coal? Yes, there is cleaner coal. And that cleaner coal occurs down towards the bottom right of this diagram, right? So in the top left is the first stage of the formation of coal, and that's peat. And that's still used in many places as a source of fuel. If you go to Ireland or Scotland, parts of Iceland, there are many places where they still farm peat, okay? It's near to the surface. They dry it out because it has a pretty low carbon content. You dry it out and you burn it, and it doesn't produce a whole lot of heat, but it produces some. So peat is the least concentrated form of coal, and then as it is subjected to heat and pressure, you get this metamorphic change, this change from peat into lignite, right? Where you're starting to squeeze out the water content and you're increasing the carbon content, into bituminous coal, right? And ultimately into anthracite, which is the most mature form of coal. As you move from top left to bottom right there, everybody, you are decreasing the bad stuff. You're decreasing the volatiles like the content of mercury or the content of sulfur, and you're increasing the carbon content, right? So you're going from really dirty stuff to cleaner coal. Of course, that's a relative term, okay? Does that make sense? So that's the change, different grades of coal. So here's the map of our coal reserves. And I'll use that term here specifically as a reserve. We know where the coal is, we know how to get in it, and it's economically viable. And this diagram shows the various grades of coal. So the little thin black lines here are the high quality or the higher quality anthracite, right? You can see some of those are up through Pennsylvania and West Virginia. The blues are subdivided into bituminous coal and subbituminous coal. Bituminous coal is still a fairly high carbon content, so that's the darker blue, and so that you can see in Texas, most of this big blue going up through Appalachia and up through Illinois is bituminous coal. Then there's subbituminous coal, and then there's the light gray, which is lignite, right? So coal is not going to run out anytime soon, certainly not in the United States. We think we've got at least 200 years of reserves, and probably beyond that, right? So coal is widespread, it's extensive, and it's still relatively cheap to get out the ground. My wife's family lived down near College Station, and they got a little ranch down there, and we go down there probably every month. And I have yet to go down the lovely I-35 and then down Highway 6 to College Station without seeing at least one and probably two of these trains with at least 100 cars on them, bringing coal in to the coal-fired power plants in and around Waco and College Station. And most of that coal is coming from this region over here. I'll go to the other board. This is Wyoming. And so this is the Powder River Basin in Wyoming up here, right? And so that is subbituminous coal, not especially clean. It's being brought in because it's so cheap to do it. And it's being brought in to the coal-fired power plants, which generally lie from Waco up towards the northeast of the state of Texas. So what you can see here are these very light colored patches. Those are the old lignite formations. And that's where the majority of the coal-fired power plants are in Texas, over these old lignite formations. And now they're getting shut down, okay? They've just shut down 3 in the last 2 years, and they're going to continue to shut down these coal-fired power plants and replace them with something better, one would hope. That's the reserve map of coal in the US. Make sense? Plenty of it, right? Okay. 1/3 of it is recoverable by strip mining, by surface mining. So that's going in where the coal seam is pretty close to the surface, right? There's been some sort of erosion and removal of material, and that coal seam is close to the surface. So you just go in and scrape away the dirt sitting on top of it, and then you can get at the coal, right? So that's strip mining. That's the most profitable way to get coal because it's the easiest. You don't have to drill down or anything like that. You just strip it away at the surface. So strip mining is widely used in the US. Here's another technique of getting the coal. This is environmentally really problematic, right? This is called mountaintop removal. I didn't really appreciate the scale of this until I took a flight from DFW to Washington, D.C. We happened to fly over West Virginia. This is not my photograph. This is from another organization. But this is mountaintop removal, where the company goes in, right, and literally removes the mountaintop. The coal seam can be 10, 20, 30, 50 feet below the surface. They scrape off that top, and they just get out the coal from there. You can see a couple in the distance here, and there's one just on the right here, right? This is really damaging to the environment. And not only does it look bad, but then the stuff that's left behind, right? The mine tailings, some of the copper and the zinc that's tied up in those sediments begins to run down the valleys. And there's been a lot of water contamination from coal mining in places like Tennessee, right? It begins to acidify the water, and we'll examine that later on in the course. Please don't go and remember the statistics on a diagram like this. This is just a quick summary, if you like, of some of the issues relating to coal. This is why coal for me is the most problematic by far, right? Anything but coal. So a typical coal-fired power plant, and I'll contextualize megawatts and so on a bit more when we look at wind, but it just produces a bunch of stuff. And that stuff isn't just atmospheric pollution. It leads to other things, right? So, for example, a typical coal-fired power plant will produce a lot of SO2, sulfur dioxide. That's a pollutant that gets converted into sulfuric acid. That's a part of acid rain, right? It produces nitrogen dioxide. That's also a part of acid rain. It produces carbon dioxide. Not a pollutant, according to the EPA, but an important greenhouse gas, and we'll unpack that when we look at climate change, right? It produces just a whole bunch of bad things. Right? So coal is the most problematic when it comes to the atmosphere by far. But it is, unfortunately, here to stay for a while, right? That's one of the great challenges when it comes to the climate, okay? If we want to reduce our carbon dioxide, this is one of the big culprits. We have to go after coal and try and switch that into cleaner technology. Now, again, a lot of people would say, well, we have to go away from fossil fuels completely. But if it's up to me, this is just my opinion. If I had a choice between coal and natural gas, that's an easy one, right? That's a no-brainer to me, right? Natural gas is much cleaner than coal, but it is here to stay. Why? Take a look at this, right? This is from a website called Carbon Brief. I know the countries, I'm trying to find a way to show the countries a little better, but what are you looking at here? What you're looking at here on the top right is the United States. You can probably, I think, maybe I'd probably have to turn the line for that. Well, you can maybe make out the United States there. So there's Mexico coming down there. Baja. On the left is India. On the right is China. On the top left is the data, right? So what is this showing here? It shows in yellow the current operating capacity of coal-fired power plants. So if you just look at the United States, right, that is 175,000 megawatts. Again, don't worry about what a megawatt is quite at the moment. I'll contextualize that a little later, right? The lights here, when you buy a light, you go to Home Depot and it has how many watts of energy can that, how many watts of power can that light produce, right? So there's 1,000 watts in a kilowatt, there's 1,000 kilowatts in a megawatt, 1,000 megawatts in a gigawatt, you go on and on and on. 175,000 megawatts is big. So there's 175,000 megawatts of coal in the United States. Look at China. There are currently almost 1 million megawatts of coal in China. And you can see the map in China on the bottom right, right? All the yellow is current coal-fired power plants in China. China has more than 5 times the amount of coal-fired power plants than we do in the United States. And India, about 230,000 megawatts. India has more coal-fired power plants than we do in the US, right? That's why we talk about these 3 countries so much, the US, India, and China. They absolutely have to be part of the solution. We, as a country, have to be at the table when it comes to things like climate change or any environmental. Look at the other stark thing on this diagram is in pink, what's under construction, and in purple, what's planned. The US doesn't have any coal-fired power plants under construction, and none are planned, right? China has about another 200,000 megawatts that are either under construction or planned, and India has about another 70,000 megawatts. And the challenge with China is that they are now funding and building coal-fired power plants in other countries that have no legacy of coal, especially in Africa, right? So they'll go in and they'll build a coal-fired power plant in a country. And of course, there's a quid pro quo, they want something for that, but they seem to be exporting their carbon footprint quite a bit. So that's the global picture. That's why coal is here to stay, I think, unequivocally. It's going to be very, very hard to shut down coal anytime soon, okay? Of course, there's an atmospheric component to this, everybody, and this is what we'll deal with in chapter 4. We're going to look at air pollution, right? But air quality is an enormous challenge, right? So you've probably heard about air quality in China, and a lot of people think that the air quality in Beijing is the worst in the world. Maybe you think the air quality where you live is the worst in the world, right? I've heard people really moan and complain about air quality in Fort Worth. China's an interesting one, as we'll see a little later on when we get to air quality, right? But here's an interesting shot. It's exactly the same location, right? I haven't photoshopped this. On the left is China, Beijing in 2008. On the right is Beijing in 2013. You can see this building right here. It's exactly the same one in the foreground here. So why 2008? What was significant about that year?
The Olympics.
It was the Olympics. Yeah. China realized it probably wouldn't be good to hold the Olympics with air quality looking like it is on the right, right? That's not just a national embarrassment, but it's a health threat. So what did they do? They significantly curtailed vehicles into the city, and they significantly curtailed cement factories and power plants. They cut everything back, and the air quality improved dramatically, right, during the Olympics. It's interesting to see what China has done in the last 5 to 8 years in terms of air quality. They have actually made dramatic steps to improve their air quality. It's still not great by US standards, but it is much, much better. And so when we start thinking about the world's most polluted cities, they're no longer in China. 1 or 2 of them are. Most of them are now in India and Pakistan, and we'll talk a little bit about it. And the other thing I just wanted to mention, everybody, and this is one of the most difficult things, I think, to really get a handle on, right? And that is, when we can talk about the cost of coal, right? The cost to actually build a power plant, to go and remove a mountaintop, or whatever, however you want to frame it. Okay, we can talk about the cost to get coal to a power plant that you and I are going to spend how many cents per kilowatt hour to get that electricity. The real cost is much more difficult to quantify. The cost to human health, the cost to air quality, the cost to ecosystem, right? One of the things that's often not talked about with coal is mercury contamination, right? When you burn coal, you produce mercury. Mercury contaminates watersheds. How do we cost that all up? Those are costs that are often ignored, right? So when we talked about value and instrumental value and intrinsic value, it's very hard to get a handle on the real cost of coal, because we think that the cost of human health is just enormous, not just in terms of things like asthma, but much more serious conditions down the line, right? So thoughts on coal, questions, comments? Yeah, let's go.
Affecting like humans' health, it would also impact animals.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the question is, does it just affect human health? No, not at all. This is, how much does it affect ecosystems and ecosystem functioning? So we'll see when we'll talk about acid rain. You burn coal, that produces SO2. SO2 becomes sulfuric acid. Sulfuric acid acidifies the soil. What does that do to forests? Well, that begins to kill forests and kill fish life because of the acidification. So there's all of these knock-on effects that become really important. Yeah.
So we have the graph of China, India, and the US. Are those the 3 countries that produce the most coal?
Yeah, and Australia.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really cool website, Carbon Brief. If you just Google Carbon Brief, and you can look at any country, Australia, South Africa has vast coal deposits. Challenge with my home country is they haven't put any money into infrastructure. So the coal-powered power plants are falling apart. They've got all the coal, they just don't know where to put it. They don't, that's the challenge with electricity. But India, China, and the US are big. So it looks like, and one of the interesting things about China when it comes to coal is President Xi has publicly stated, I think I may have mentioned this, that China is going to become carbon neutral, net zero by 2060, right? Which is an enormous challenge. And I think if any country can do it, they probably can, because they'll just come down as a government and with an edict, right? But what does that mean? That means they have to ramp up wind, solar, and nuclear dramatically to be able to reduce their dependence. Because China right now gets 70% of its electricity from coal. 70. How are they going to go from 70 to essentially zero in the space of 40 years? Right? We'll see. Big challenge. Other questions? Good questions. Bill. Thoughts? Good. Okay. Well, we've got 7 minutes, so let's keep going. Let me just set the scene here. So that's coal, right? So when it comes to me, coal, bam, out. There. Let's talk about this, the petroleum age. So the 19th century is the coal age, the 20th century, of course, is the petroleum age. So again, let's just set the scene here, some context. These are the top 10 oil consumers. And I've scaled this. I don't have the 2020 data yet. They're still trying to figure all that out with COVID and everything. So I've scaled these circles relative to one another, right? So the United States is the largest consumer of oil in the world. There's China, you can see Japan there, South Korea, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia. So those are the top 10, all scaled to one another, of oil consumers. Yet, you know, is it absolutely right to use oil and petroleum interchangeably? No, because we take crude oil and we refine it into a number of petroleum products. But, so this is oil consumption. We currently consume about 101.6, let's just say about 100 million barrels of oil per day. 100 million barrels of oil per day, of which the US consumes 20, right? So we consume 20 million barrels of oil per day, over 100 million around the world. So we consume about a fifth of all the world's oil as a country. That's why that bubble is so big. So that's pretty extraordinary, right? Now there's quite a complicated diagram in the book here, okay? And what I've decided to do is just break this diagram out and introduce you to the various components, okay? So this is world oil production from 65 to 2019, and we're going to make some projections out. And I think if we have time, we will. That'll be a good place to leave it. So this is oil production from 65 to 2019. Right, and there is your 101.6 million barrels per day. Everybody see that? Right, there's the oil crisis there, 1973, and it wiggles around a bit. The financial crisis doesn't really show up. We'll see what COVID is. COVID is not on there. It'll be quite interesting to see what COVID does for global oil consumption. So there it is. We start at about 30 million barrels per day, and we are now at 101.6. It doesn't look like we're slowing down our production of oil anytime soon. Then in the 1980s, a very well-known British geologist by the name of George Campbell, right, comes out with this prediction that we are running out of oil. And he coins this term peak oil. And he said that we are going to reach peak oil in about 2006 to 2007, and then oil will begin to decline because it is a non-renewable, a finite resource, right? There's a finite amount of oil on this planet, okay? And oil is just like coal. Oil is not the prehistoric transformation of vegetation. It's the transformation of marine organisms, prehistoric marine organisms, right? That settle down and then they get converted into crude oil. Doesn't look like Campbell really was spot on here, does it? Right? And this really got people's attention. People have been talking about this as a finite resource for a while, but Campbell came out and said, peak oil, by the late 2000s, before we move into 2010, we're going to be on the decline. Right? Why do you think he was so wrong? How can you be so badly wrong in a projection like that? We just keep producing. Yeah, we're finding more and more reserves, right? And we're able to go back into reserves that we didn't think we could get by fracking. Fracking isn't just a natural gas thing. right? When you frack rock, you can get oil and natural gas if they occur together. So unconventional reservoirs, okay, like the tar sands in Canada and Venezuela, and the continued exploration and finding new reserves has kept that going, right? Then there's a fairly well-respected consulting firm in Cambridge, CERA. They say, you know what? I think Campbell was wrong. We're probably looking at peak oil here by about 2030. So this came out in 2000. 2000, they make their projections, and they're not really very close, right? They see a much more conservative than Campbell, but we are clearly ahead of that, right? This line here that I've put on here is the Asian Phoenix demand. That is the projection of what the China, India, Southeast Asia demand is going to be. Remember that map of there are more people living inside that circle than living outside of that circle? This is one of the implications, the ramifications of that diagram, right? Is that the demand from Asia is going to increase. Now, what this suggests is that our current production is not quite meeting the demand, right? So where is that demand going to come from? That demand, this is the big environmental challenge. If we are going to feed that thirst for oil, it's going to have to come from unconventional reservoirs, like the Venezuela tar sands or the Canadian tar sands, or we're going to have to find more reserves, right? Does everybody see that? So what this diagram implies here is that as we move forward to 2050, right? So we think about another 2.5 billion people coming along. The projections are that if this line keeps going up, right? If we're at 106 and it keeps going up and it keeps going up and it approximates what the Asian Phoenix demand is, we're going to have to find 22 to 25 million barrels of new oil, right, per day to be able to satisfy that demand, unless something changes, right? Unless we suddenly go, you know what, maybe electric vehicles are the way to go here, right? Now we're still not remotely putting a dent into that demand. As nice as Teslas are, does anybody have an electric vehicle? I should probably ask that. Anybody got an EV? Nobody? I do not. So please don't take that. Right? Anybody got a hybrid? Someone got a hybrid. Nope. You got one?
One that I drive does. It's not
Okay.
my car, but I drive it.
Okay, cool. That's it. All right. See, we've got a way to go here, right? There's this enormous challenge, this magical process of putting up to the gas pump, pumping it in, still relatively cheap to other parts of the world, even though it's gone up. We drive for 300 miles and then we do it all again and we do it all again and we do it all again, right? This is the challenge. This is the economic and environmental challenge moving ahead. So we're not at peak oil. It doesn't look like we're going to run out anytime soon. It is finite, right? We're going to have to make a change at some point. But we are going to have to find 20+ million barrels a day more to satisfy that demand. I just put on there the price of oil, which of course varies tremendously, right? When I put this book, sent this off to the publisher, originally I'd said that's the end of cheap oil, right? Oil was at about $65 a barrel, it was $70 a barrel. And no sooner had it gone to the publisher that it hit $30 a barrel, right? So it's all over the place. All right, that's a good place to stop, because we'll come back and look at oil in a bit more detail.